Hey guys, working off my iPad today, so bear with me. So today's lecture is the end of World War II. Well, United States in World War II, how it ends, and kind of a little bit of post-war stuff, like how are we going to reorganize the world after another world war. So we've already kind of looked at U.S. propaganda and what it looks like on the home front in the United States. Essentially, during the war, right at that point when we joined the war, when the Japanese attack us at Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, the military mobilization begins. So war mobilization, just to review, means that we are prepping for war, getting ready for war, politically, socially, and economic. So the selective service registration expanded during this time period to men from 18 to 65 after Pearl Harbor. And the period of enlistment extended to 6 months after fighting had begun. There were also women that were mobilized into the war, not in combat roles, though. So almost 300,000 women enlisted in the Women's Army Corps, women appointed for voluntary emergency service, and Women's Auxiliary Ferrying Squadron, which is really, really cool. And Women's Army Service Pilot, that last one, WAF and WASP, were flying. Their job was to test planes and fly them to where they needed to be ferried overseas. So fly them cross country in the United States, and then they'd be put on some sort of aircraft carrier to be taken overseas. And the reason that this was even started was that they had all these men that were testing planes and training other people on how to test planes, and they would get drafted. And then they'd have to train another man, and then he'd get drafted. And so the solution to this was women, because they couldn't be drafted into combat roles or drafted at all. So they started using women for plane testing. Women also were medical and technical support, mechanics, cryptography decoding, so like decoding messages, which is really cool as well. When it comes to minorities, over 1 million minorities volunteered or were drafted into the war. African American men could be drafted, but they were put into segregated units still. And it was a point of contention because overseas the units were just thrown together anyway, and when you're on the battlefield it doesn't matter. Essentially, so they found some freedom and lack of discrimination overseas, and then came back home after the war and felt all that discrimination again. Now, there were people that dissented. 72,000 claimed conscientious objection, which means they're pacifists or their religion keeps them from fighting. And some even refused to register, and they were jailed. If you didn't show up for the draft, you could be fined or put... or put into jail, and about 5,500 people that happened to. So by the war's end, we had 16 million men and women working in the military in some capacity for the war effort. We also need to mobilize our economy because we had been helping Great Britain and France building supplies, and sending them over, but now we ourselves in our own military need those supplies. So a lot of factories were converted over to military supply factories, and some of those were converted by force. So the Office for War Mobilization is established to supervise different agencies intended to increase war factory production. The War Production Board was established in 1942 by FDR, and the whole purpose of this is to regulate how raw materials are used, and using those raw materials for war and not for consumer goods. So it's estimated that about half of factory production went into making war materials. It was kind of like the government came knocking on factories' doors and said, knock, 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 guess what? You don't make refrigerators anymore, you make tank engines. And some of it was by force. It's kind of a, if you think about it, it's kind of a threatening to civil liberties. But it was kind of this all in this together spirit, and most of them went willingly. And this is where propaganda comes in. So Rosie the Riveter, we've talked about her a little bit in class before, was kind of this symbol of 5 million women joining the workforce during the war. Sometimes they moved to new communities to find jobs in aircraft, munitions, automobile industries. They were trying to make a paycheck for their family while their husbands were away. And this propaganda campaign urged women to fill the ranks of the assembly lines that had been left destitute because men were being drafted left and right. So commercials and films and cartoons and propaganda pamphlets kind of characterize this Rosie the Riveter symbolic character as an American hero. Like, women, you can do an unwomanly job, a man's job for the war effort. Women's magazines and newspapers discuss the suitability of women's smaller hands for delicate tasks in machinery. And women's increased wages really bumped up family incomes and the economy, and it paved the way for this post-war boom that's going to happen when we get to our next unit. Now, this isn't women's rights here. I mean, average woman's pay is still less than 2/3 of a man's pay. And then after the war, when men come home and those factory jobs are no longer necessary because we're not in a war, women often return back home, and there's pressures increased for them to return to homemaking rather than stay in the workforce. All of that is what I just said, so copy that down. So the government also tries to control inflation. More people are working, but there's less consumer goods available. If there's too much money, then inflation will increase in the cost of living. The COL will increase, and so the government is going to try and control the money supply to keep the cost of living the same. The War Labor Board was established to maintain, but not really improve workers' rights and standard of living, but kind of just keep their wages at pace with the cost of living. This is kind of in contrast to World War I, where inflation was just allowed to run rampant. Now the government has kind of learned their lesson. The Office of Price Administration is exactly what it sounds like. In 1942, the government chooses to freeze prices and freeze rent as much as they have the power to do so. So essentially, the hope is that will stop the rampant inflation that happened during World War I, and the wages that people are making, that women who normally wouldn't work outside the home, will actually mean something to their family instead of just prices increasing with the family's income. The Office of Price Administration also is in charge of rationing, and rationing means that your family is given a certain amount of food that they can buy if they are goods that are in high demand, like milk, sugar, flour, coffee. And the hope is that when a family is issued a book of coupons for the purchase of meat or sugar or gas or coffee, that when you went to the store, you'd say, I want to buy milk. Here's my milk coupon. They would say, okay, you can buy 2 gallons of milk. And it depended on the size of your family. And that was to force, instead of just voluntarily, the saving and conserving of materials so that food resources could go to the military and to our soldiers and our allies overseas. They also did this with lots of big consumer goods. Cars, tires, and typewriters. If you wanted to buy one of those things, you had to apply to a local government rationing board. If you were accepted, you could prove that you actually needed it. You would receive a certificate allowing you to buy the item. And essentially, the hope there was that factories would be making less consumer goods that were just going to sit on the shelf and instead be making military goods. The government also pours tons of money into research and development for radar, which was relatively new technology and not extremely accurate at the time. Like we talked about with Pearl Harbor, it can't see through mountains. People didn't trust it, so they just left radar stations unmanned, but it will get better by the end of the war. And insecticides, so pesticides, trying to ramp up food production and not lose any to animals or anything or bugs, so that more food can be sent overseas to our allies and our troops. And then the Manhattan Project, I don't know why this says homework reading, ignore that. I'll just give you the short of it here. In 1942, it was an established research project to build an atomic bomb. It was formed after Albert Einstein sent a letter to FDR in 1939 that said, the Germans are working on some sort of bomb using nuclear tactics, and we need to get on it. It was conducted at various locations, but its headquarters was an office in Manhattan. Over 100,000 people were involved and were sworn to secrecy with non-disclosure agreements. And it was tested, the bomb itself was tested in the Alamogordo desert in New Mexico, where a German scientist that had defected to the United States, Dr. Robert Oppenheimer, helped with the testing of the bomb, and it like melted the thermometers. It knocked out windows 125 miles away. And supposedly when that happened, Dr. Oppenheimer said, "I have become death, the destroyer of dreams," basically saying, I've created something that's going to end the world, and he was right. So the bomb is kept under wraps until it's actually dropped over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which we'll talk about later. So that's the Manhattan Project. So let's talk about home front discrimination and the life of minorities during the war, because there's lots of different aspects to this. You could also lump women into this category if there were to be some sort of SANDBQ on home front minorities. But for the purposes of this, we're going to focus on African Americans, Latino Americans, and Japanese Americans. All right, so when it comes to African Americans, there were lots of civil rights issues during this time period. The Great Migration is still continuing, massive migration of minorities to industrial centers for war jobs, and it resulted in competition for scarce resources like housing and tension in the workplace. And so we get this whole new swing of race riots in 47 cities, and the worst was in Detroit. So there's a man named Philip Randolph who is president of a civil rights organization, and he realizes in different cities in America that African Americans were excluded from the well-paying jobs in war-related industries and were forced to work more on the low-skilled assembly line jobs. And so he makes demands of the president: equal access to all war and defense jobs, desegregation of the armed forces, and the end of segregation in federal agencies. And actually, he proposed a Black March on Washington in 1941. And kind of that pressure caused FDR, the threat of that caused FDR to sign Executive Order 8802 in 1941, establishing fair employment practices. And hoping to send government employees to investigate discrimination violations in the defense industry. And Philip Randolph actually canceled the march. So the result was that government agencies, job training programs, and even defense war industries did make some gains in ending segregation. And Randolph is kind of dubbed like the beginning of the civil rights movement, in a sense, even before the war actually ends. During this time period, the NAACP grows in membership as well. All right, when it comes to Mexican Americans, there are two important events that need to be discussed for the war. The first is the Bracero program. So with men off to war and women in factories, there's still this huge need for food and farm workers in the United States to feed our allies and our troops overseas. And so the U.S. government put forth the Bracero program, which is a policy for short-term work permits to be issued to Mexican workers for them to come over into the United States for a short amount of time and work as farmhands, especially in the Southwest and in California. And that is where those places get some of their Mexican American population, because lots of them never left. So that was a huge migration of people into the United States. And the Zoot Suit riots in LA is kind of a result of that. So young Mexican Americans become the target of attacks in LA around these naval bases. So sailors, these white sailors, are kind of like on leave around this area. They're roaming the streets, and they, just because of discrimination and racism, start attacking these Mexican Americans that are called zooters because they wear what's called zoot suits, which are like these big baggy suits with these big hats. And they wore their hair long, and the white sailors would, when they're attacking them, cut their hair. So radio reporters at the time, of course, blamed the Mexican Americans, the zooters, but a city committee investigated it and said that the issue was competition for scarce resources and competition for housing between those sailors on leave and the Mexican Americans. But it was just an example of violence against another minority group in America. But the worst is Japanese Americans. We're going to talk about this extensively in class, so I'm just going to very quickly go through it. FDR signs Executive Order 9066 in February of 1942, so not long after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, 3 months. So the FDR basically calls the West Coast a war theater, and in times of war, civil liberties just go out the window. Immediately, 110,000 people of Japanese ancestry were seen as suspicious. They were living in California, and some of them were living in little, they called them little Tokyos in San Francisco and Seattle, ethnic enclaves, and they were forcibly interned into internment camps, which is basically a relocation camp. Some of them were foreign-born, but most of them were their Japanese children, so American-born, Japanese Americans. And they were given 48 hours notice, and it was, you can bring one suitcase per person, everything else has got to go. And whole towns, whole little tiny enclaves in big cities are just gone within 2 days, loaded up on trains and taken to these camps where they're not even done building yet. Some of them were sleeping in horse stalls, and then during the day, the men were building new barracks for them. So essentially, these camps were in desolate areas, conditions were harsh, but Japanese Americans, there was no evidence that they were spying or helping Japan in any way, shape, or form. Many of them were extremely loyal to the U.S. By war's end, almost 18,000 Japanese Americans fight in the U.S. Army. And the government never considered relocation of Germans and Italians. It was just the Japanese singled out by the government. In the Supreme Court case Korematsu versus the U.S., which we're going to read about, the Supreme Court holds up that internment is allowed because it's time of war, so they can restrict civil liberties. You're not allowed to second-guess military decisions, essentially. So these are kind of the conditions. Here's a get out. Here is the barbed wire fence around, and here's a nicer example of an internment camp right there. All right, so let's talk war here. The United States and the Allied powers. So the Allied powers consist of Britain, France, who's kind of decapitated at this point, the Soviet Union, Russia, and the United States. And Germany has basically taken over everything except for the British Isles, and they are invading Russia, which they make the mistake of invading in the wintertime. We'll get to that in a minute. So this is America's European theater, and we know from our battles timeline that they start invading this area at D-Day. They go from the British Isles over to the beaches of Normandy, and then their goal is to spread out from there and free the rest of Europe while Russia comes in from this way. So the hope is to attack them from both sides. So this grand alliance, the Allied powers, create the United Nations, which will be more important after the war. And again, their goal is attack Germany first, try and blockade the European continent so that Germany and Italy starve, kind of like we did the First World War, and then also bomb Germany. And the goal is to bomb German railroads because that's their main form of transportation. We've already done that. All right. The Pacific doesn't go as well because, remember, our naval fleet was destroyed mostly at Pearl Harbor. So it takes us about a year and a half to start winning in the Pacific. During the first 6 months, it just looked likely that the Allied powers were not going to win in Germany, in Europe, in the Pacific. So the Japanese had taken Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, Dutch East Indies, and the Philippines. A bunch of U.S. territories completely taken, a bunch of baby islands with native peoples steamrolled by the Japanese, and they were very violent fighters. And the U.S. lost the Philippines. So 20,000 U.S. troops that had been fortified at the Philippines basically have to give up in what's known as the Bataan Death March. They surrender and they're forced to march 85 miles. They're tortured, burned alive. If you couldn't continue, you were shot or left for dead. And essentially, it's just this example of the U.S. super losing in the beginning. And actually, there was a unit of men from Harrodsburg that were sent to the Philippines, and many of them died in the Bataan Death March. And there's a road in Harrodsburg named after them. Doolittle's raid on Tokyo basically is like America's attempt at revenge on Tokyo. Americans executed this insignificant raid on Japan where they drop a few bombs in retaliation for Pearl Harbor, but it makes Americans feel like more morale because we hadn't struck back after Pearl Harbor yet. We were losing all these Pacific battles. There are some turning points that we talked about in our battles timeline. So Stalingrad is maybe the most important battle of the war, and there were not many Americans there, if any. Basically, it's the biggest Nazi defeat on land. They invade the city of Stalingrad in Russia. It's wintertime. That was a mistake. Russians just throw men at the problem. I mean, millions of Soviet Union men die, but there's more of them than there are Germans. And so the German army will retreat from Stalingrad. For the rest of the war, they're retreating. They will not get any further into Russia after they are beat at the Battle of Stalingrad. Okay? D-Day, obviously, an amphibious landing where our hope is to capture France and then start a land invasion of Germany from the other side. So we've got Russia coming from one side and Britain, some French, Canadian, and mostly U.S. men invading from the other side, okay? So once we get our crap together in the Pacific and we rebuild our naval fleet, the notion of island hopping is pretty important, and you read about this in your battles timeline. Island hopping is the goal of taking island by island by island back from the Japanese and getting closer and closer to the mainland while the government's deciding what they want to do with mainland Japan. So chase the Japanese out of the Pacific. So the Battle of Coral Sea, the Battle of Midway, which is a huge turning point because we actually start winning the war because we break the Japanese code. The Japanese lose a bunch of aircraft carriers and planes on those aircraft carriers. So basically the Battle of Midway is the point where it's like, okay, we might win here in the Pacific. Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, which is where this very famous picture was taken, the Battle of Iwo Jima. And now Iwo Jima is so close to mainland Japan that fighter planes are now close enough to bomb. And so a bunch of B-29s are sent to Iwo Jima after we won the island. And actually one of these men, it's either this man or you can just see his arm, or this man, I don't remember, is from Kentucky. He's from Maysville, Kentucky. The Battle of Okinawa, and then finally reaching up to mainland Japan, and a decision needs to be made. And while that decision is being made, they're sending B-29s all the time to firebomb mainland Japan, especially going after military bases, railroads, any form of transportation. All right, so VE Day. We'll come back and talk about the atomic bomb here in a second. But basically, with the U.S. invading from the west and the USSR invading from the east, it's basically over. They have made it to Germany. Both troops are going to kind of meet in Berlin, although Russia gets there first. And Hitler feels the heat and commits suicide, supposedly in his bunker, with his mistress that he married that day, Eva Braun. It's unknown whether how he committed suicide. Some people say he didn't, he escaped, but there's more evidence to prove that he did by some sort of poisoning or gunshot, and there's different accounts. And the Germans were instructed to burn / decay his body with lime and chemicals and things like that, and bury it. It's unknown whether that happened because the Russians get to Berlin first and find the bunker before American and British troops can. But Hitler's dead. He didn't escape. He's not in Chile or Bolivia or wherever people say he is, or Peru. Mussolini, the Italian dictator, there's an uprising in Italy because they're starving due to the Allied blockade. They stage a coup. They kill Mussolini, his top officials, and his wife, drag them through the streets and hang them up in the city square, and so people come by and spit on their dead bodies. And then May 7th, 1945, Germany and Italy officially surrender because they have no leaders, and that is what we know as VE Day, Victory Over Europe Day. And slowly but surely, troops will be brought home from those areas after some rebuilding. As the troops continue throughout Europe and make it into Germany and Poland during and after the surrender, they find the Holocaust camps, the extermination camps and concentration camps, and start to liberate those people. And lots of U.S. money is sent towards helping Jewish people in Europe. Russia finds most of the concentration camps and liberates them, but U.S. and British troops also help in that process. FDR is elected, and I'm going super fast through this, sorry guys. FDR is elected to his 4th term. He dies within 4 months, just being an elderly man, the stress of the war, already kind of sickly, and his vice president, Harry S. Truman, becomes president. All right, but before that happens, there are still some end of war conferences. I don't want to say end of war because the war's not over, but essentially when the Allies realize that they're going to win, they start meeting, talking about how they hope to end it all. So before FDR dies in December 1943, the FDR, Stalin, and Churchill meet in Tehran. And the Allies at that point agreed to invading Western Europe. Stalin says the Soviet Union will enter a war against Japan. They never really do that. They discuss invading Japan, but no decision is really reached. It's not until after the war, in 1945 at the Yalta Conference, that a lot more decisions are made. And this is basically February 1945. The war's not over yet, but essentially it's coming to an end. VE Day will be in May, and then Victory Over Japan will be in August. So Stalin says, this time for real, I'm going to enter the Pacific War within 3 months after Germany surrendering, essentially. And Stalin agrees to say every country that had been steamrolled over and taken by Germany, they will have free and fair elections. The USSR will not intervene. Also a lie. And together they all decide we need a world organization that's going to meet and talk about how to preserve peace, and that's the UN. And basically, a decision was made that the UN would have permanent members called the Security Council, and those would be the biggest, I guess, the most powerful countries in the world at the time. The U.S., Great Britain, Soviet Union, France, and China would be permanent members. They also decided that Germany is going to be divided into occupied zones. So they're going to take Germany and cut it up like a piece of pie and say France gets this part, UK gets this part, USSR, this is not the parts, and US gets this part. It wasn't actually this division, but basically cut it up like a piece of pie and occupy it to make sure that they're not going to try anything again. And that's the Yalta Conference. The war's not even over yet. Once the war is finally over in Europe, they meet at the Potsdam Conference, but this time FDR is dead and Truman takes his place. So we've got Truman, Stalin, the new Prime Minister of Britain, Clement Attlee. They got rid of Churchill, and they meet at Potsdam in Eastern Germany. In the conference, they disagree. They're just fighting the whole time, and this war alliance, this glorious war alliance, is starting to break down. And it's at this moment that Truman and Clement Attlee realize Stalin ain't our friend anymore. And this could be the beginning of the Cold War. Now, they didn't know that at the time, but now we look back and think, oh yeah, that was it. And at this conference, Truman orders and tells Stalin and Attlee about the dropping of the atomic bomb that's going to happen literally a few days after the conference ends. And they approve of it. They also talk about war crimes trials for criminals, especially criminals responsible for the Holocaust and concentration camps, and how to demilitarize and denazify Germany. Get rid of the Nazi Party and get rid of their military so that this can't happen again, so that we don't repeat the World War I into World War II issues. So let's talk atomic bomb after the atomic bomb is dropped after the Potsdam Conference. So August 6th, August 6th, 1945 is when the first atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. The reason that an atomic bomb was chosen is because military advisors and strategists said that casualties would be massive if there was a land invasion of Japan like what we tried on D-Day, the amphibious landing sort of idea. They decided that firebombing and regular bombing with B-29s over Japan wasn't doing the job. They weren't surrendering, despite the fact that Germany had already surrendered. And so this new technology, nuclear tactics to destroy massive amounts of life, was the decision that was made. And we're not going to discuss whether that was the right decision or the wrong decision. It was the decision that was made, so let's study it. So the Enola Gay is the plane that drops the bomb, and the bomb is nicknamed Little Boy, and they paint it on the side. And the Japanese government doesn't surrender. It's estimated that up to 100,000 were killed immediately at Hiroshima. There was a very bright flash of light. It was purposefully detonated in the air so that the ground would not absorb any impact. It was so hot that water just evaporated instantly. People within the mile radius of where it was detonated were just gone, just absolutely gone. And people outside of that city center buildings were falling on them and burning them. Anything metal was so hot that it started melting. There was just nothing left. And it gets better and better as you go out, but water evaporated instantly, and the government doesn't surrender. So over Nagasaki and other cities, there are pamphlets dropped by the U.S. military that say, ask your government to surrender. We have an atomic bomb. We will use another one. And evacuate your cities. And they do not surrender. And so a second bomb is dropped on August 9th, 1945 in Nagasaki. It was nicknamed Fat Man. And the same thing happened. It's estimated that over 80,000 were dead instantly, and then many, many injuries, cancers, birth defects for generations to come happen after the dropping of the atomic bomb. So on September 2nd, Japanese formally surrendered. That is supposed to say September 2nd. I am so sorry. September 2nd, 1945 is Victory over Japan Day. And essentially, World War II is over then. And the decision to drop the atomic bomb was extremely controversial then and now. Some people think, was Truman just trying to intimidate the Soviet Union in the post-World War by using the bomb? Truman went to his grave saying that was not what he was doing. He just needed to end the war immediately. Some people say that just demonstrating the bomb on an island close to Japan and detonating an island would have been enough. Proponents of the bomb say that the U.S. winning at Iwo Jima and Okinawa took thousands of U.S. lives because of the violent tactics of Japanese soldiers. And so that was just like a foretelling of horrible land invasion that might have happened. So the bomb was the best way to save U.S. lives and even Japanese lives. Some military officials thought that Japan could be broken if they blockaded the whole island and started starving their citizens, like we did with continental Europe. Some people say Hiroshima was fine, but Nagasaki wasn't. They should have given them more time. It's just there's so many different things we could have talked about, so many different options, but the option that was taken was 2 bombs dropped 3 days apart on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and it's called indiscriminate killing, where it doesn't matter. They're not targeting soldiers or military bases. Men, women, and children were the target. Innocent civilians were the target. Even some Americans died that were held in prisoner of war camps. Some American missionaries that were living in Japan died as well. It was completely indiscriminate killing. So that's the controversy. So let's talk results here. Hold on, let me flip my page. Massive casualties, obviously. We've got 55 million dead, 35 million wounded, millions of people missing. 400,000 American soldiers are dead, and millions of civilians. Not only that, but Europeans lost their homeland. Completely needed to relocate. Their cities were burnt to the ground. Their houses were burnt to the ground. Their farms were stripped of resources. So massive destructions of cities, even on the island of Great Britain, due to German bombing, specifically in the Battle of Britain. From the war stems a lot of political issues as well. Tensions with the USSR and their prominence of communism. Before World War II, Stalin's communist dictatorship was condemned by the West, but we needed him in the war, so we were allies. And then afterward, it's like, okay, we don't like communism again. And the fear was that Stalin and the USSR would kind of like take over those very needy, very poor countries that Germany had taken over as well. And that's exactly what happens. So Eastern Europe, the USSR, they were promised self-determination, which means the right to have their own government and say what their own government is, but we all know Stalin is going to take over those areas. So what to do with Germany here? The U.S. and Great Britain want a strong Germany because we don't want this whole World War II situation to repeat itself, because that's what we did with World War I, where we weakened them so much. Now, USSR does not, because the USSR wants like this buffer zone between itself and Western Europe, where Great Britain and France are. They want this area where there's space between our communism and your not communism. And they don't want a strong Germany because in 30 years they've been attacked twice by Germany and lost millions of men. So by the war's end, the Soviets were controlling a lot of Eastern Europe that Germany had previously controlled. Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary. Even the Soviets were driving Nazis from Poland and Czechoslovakia and kind of setting up their own pseudo little governments. And Stalin had promised those free and fair elections, but it does not happen. There's also this huge shift in balance of power. Western Europe is no longer the leader in world affairs. It's the U.S. versus the USSR, and we are the two world superpowers here. So after the war, nationalism becomes a major force throughout the world. Colonies demand independence. Specifically, the big one I'm thinking about is India declaring independence from Great Britain. A lot of African countries demand independence as well. The U.S. gives up some of its territorial land holdings in the Pacific. And French Indochina, which is now Vietnam, tries to resist European rule. So we've got these colonies asking for independence, and then the Soviet Union kind of looking at them like, do you want to join our country? Do you want some communist influence? We also got huge social change. African Americans had gained job opportunities during the war that had been denied to them, and hopes were raised that this will be the beginning and soldiers fought overseas and came home and really wanted that equality that they felt overseas and didn't get it. Women felt the same. They'd gain these job opportunities during the war, but when those soldiers come home and those war jobs go away, they get pushed back into the home again. And we'll also see like a shifting in population to the southern United States, known as the Sun Belt, like California, Texas, and the southeastern United States. And the new technology as well, obviously nuclear bombs, synthetic materials like plastic, improvement in airplanes and radar. We're going to start seeing commercial planes as well, and then the atomic age here. But the main gist here is that the end of World War I sows the seeds for the Cold War. One directly leads to the other. Just like World War I led to World War II, World War II leads to the Cold War because of the tensions that are caused here, cause tensions between the U.S. and the USSR, which is what we call the Cold War. All right. Thank you guys very much.